All right, everyone. So I want to talk to you guys about something that I've been thinking about for a while now, and that is how people really will prove your point when you make some sort of an observation about their ideology or ideologies. So, for example, if someone were to say, hey, look, there's a lot of fanatics in Israel and they want to genocide the Palestinians. A lot of times, what will happen, in fact, every time, what happens every single time, is that you will have these pro-Israel types, these pro-Israel advocates, Hosperis, as they are also known, will come out and they'll say something like, no, that's not true. We do not want to genocide anyone. Okay, fine. Maybe you guys don't want to genocide people, but there are definitely people in Israel who do want to exterminate and massacre and ethnically cleanse the Palestinian populations of Gaza and the West Bank. And they'll say, no, that's not true. This is not the mission of Israel at all. So then you tell them about the articles about Israeli soldiers murdering Palestinians as they are trying to get food at these aid distribution centers. These Palestinians will queue for food outside of these aid distribution centers, and Israeli soldiers will open fire on them. And they'll say, yeah, this is all just a bunch of fake news. This isn't real. It's all a bunch of garbage because we say so. And your source is Hollywood, and your source is really just a bunch of Palestinian liars. So then you will find an article in which there are quotes from IDF soldiers themselves admitting that they were given the orders to open fire on Palestinians as they were queuing for food outside of these aid distribution centers. And you'll say, look, I'm not getting my information from Palestinians. I'm getting my information from Israeli soldiers. What say you? And they'll say, well, this article is lying and the author is lying. Well, okay, but the article is published by an Israeli newspaper, Haaretz in this case. And they'll say, well, Haaretz, they're a bunch of liars and it's all a bunch of nonsense and blah, blah, blah. And they'll just keep denying it. So then you find videos of Palestinians literally being shot at. And you can find several of these videos on Twitter/X. And they'll say, well, you know what? It's a war, and those Palestinians are pro-Hamas anyway. In other words, those Palestinians deserve it. Okay, so you are in favor of murder. You are in favor of genocide and massacres and mass murder. And so they will prove your point. That's the whole thing. This is my observation about these people. They will prove your point. Same thing goes with the Nazis. If I say, listen, people who deny the Holocaust are Nazis, and a bunch of people will come out and say, well, that's not true. Well, how do you know that's not true? Why do you say that's not true? Well, because, Nazism was great. And I get these types writing me. They'll say, actually, no, Ted, you're wrong about Holocaust denialism. And you're wrong when you say that Nazism is going to come back. Because Nazism is great. And what's wrong with Nazism? And I'll get these kinds of comments. What's wrong with Nazism? If I say, hey, listen, Nazism is coming back, this is really bad. I'll get these comments that will say something like, what's wrong with Nazism? Nazism is great. Hitler was great. What do you mean what's wrong with Nazism? It led to the murder of millions upon millions of people. Well, but those Jews really had it coming. Yeah, and people will say things like this. And they'll say something like, it wasn't 6 million, it was 1 million, or it was 600,000. But you know what? Those Jews who were killed, they deserved it. So you're in favor of mass murder, and you're a Nazi. And the fact that I'm getting a lot of comments of this murderous nature, the fact that I'm getting these kinds of comments really does bespeak a very diabolical shift in society. In other words, Hitler is making a comeback, and these sorts of comments really are an indication of this phenomenon. People will continuously prove your point. The people who disagree with you, when you are warning others about something that is very evil and dangerous, are the ones who are a part of the evil phenomenon that you're warning about. So if I'm warning about the rise of Nazism, and a bunch of people go against me, the people who are going against me are Nazis. If I am talking about Israeli atrocities and war crimes and the massacres of Palestinians, the people who go against me are people who support that sort of thing. Because if I'm think about it, if I'm talking about Israeli atrocities and I'm providing all the evidence for these atrocities, you have either you have only three choices, really. You can say, Ted, you're right, this is evil, and just admit to the truth, or you can deny it and try to cover it up like Mike Huckabee is doing, or you could support the killing. Now, if you support the killing, you're just looking at the evidence, realizing, or you know that this is a reality, and you like what's happening. If you're denying it, what that means is that you're looking at the evidence, you know that the evidence exists, so you're not being ignorant. You're not ignorant in this case, and you can't claim ignorance in this case. But you're denying it, which means you are denying reality, which means you don't really care about the truth because you don't really care to condemn the reality that's happening because you like the reality, because the truth is undeniable. So why would you deny the truth unless, of course, you support what's happening? And so the people who see the reality of what Israel's doing and deny it are people who know the truth, but are denying it because they are supporting the very entity that is doing the evil. Regardless, they are proving my point, and they are proving the point that everyone is making about Israel, that a lot of people are making about Israel, and Israel can't hide it anymore. Israel can't hide the facts anymore. I was looking at this interview with, I think his name is Danny Danon, and this guy is a spokesperson for Israel. He's Israel's representative in the United Nations, if I'm not mistaken. And this guy just denies everything. I mean, his strategy is to just deny. That's not true. That's not true. That's not, the Israeli accent. That's not true. I'm doing the French accent. That's not true. Whatever. That's not true. That's not true. That's not true. That's not true. Just deny, 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 deny. You can't hide it anymore. And the fact that you're denying this evil means that you support it because the evidence is all there. It's the same thing with the Holocaust. There is so much overwhelming evidence for the Holocaust that if someone were to deny the Holocaust, knowing the evidence, that person would be truly, truly exposing himself as a Nazi. Because why would you try to cover up for something that is so blatantly evident and true, unless, of course, you support the crime? Why do criminals cover up the evidence? Because they support what they did, and they're shameless about it. That's the reality. And so, same thing goes with one of my last videos that I did. I said, hey, anyone who obsesses over Israel is going to lose their minds. And I gave all of the examples. The Crusades was a fixation on Jerusalem. Zionism is a fixation on Jerusalem. Christian Zionism is a fixation on Jerusalem. And anyone who and also Islam fixates on Jerusalem. And anyone who partakes in this sort of behavior, anyone who partakes in this sort of thing, loses their minds. They fall into madness. Perfect example. Look at Mike Huckabee. This is a guy who claims Jesus, who claims to follow Christ, who claims to follow the gospel, and he goes to Gaza to cover up for Israel's crimes. And he says, no, there's no mass murder happening outside of these food distribution centers. Totally lies, totally covers it up. How can you live such a contradiction? How could you be such a walking contradiction? Unless, of course, you are a double-minded person and you're evil. And you have fallen into madness. You have spiraled downwards into the path of madness, knowing that God is against what Israel is doing because God is against mass murder. And yet covering up for the crimes, living a double-minded life, living a contradictory life, being a walking contradiction, one cannot help but fall into madness in such a state. That's Mike Huckabee, and that's all the evangelicals who cover up for that stuff. But why do they cover up for these evils? Why does Mike Huckabee cover up for this evil? Because he worships Jerusalem. His religion is not Christ. His religion is Jerusalem. And what does the book of Zechariah say? It says, anyone who obsesses over Jerusalem, anyone who lifts up Jerusalem will be cut to pieces. And I will make Jerusalem into a trembling cup for all the nations. A trembling cup of what? A trembling cup of wine. wine that makes one drunk and mad. And that is the reality. Same thing goes with the Crusades. And I said this about the Crusades. I said the Crusades was about what? Jerusalem. Fixating on Jerusalem. And what happened? What happened during the Crusades? Christians butchered each other. Crusades were vying over power. The Crusaders would vie over power, over who was going to rule over Jerusalem. And then you had the sacking of Constantinople, in which you had Western Christians butchering Eastern Christians by the tens of thousands, butchering, raping, and pillaging Eastern Christians by the tens of thousands. And these were Christians who were supposed to be fighting for Jerusalem. And here they were raping and butchering Eastern Orthodox Christians. Why would they do such an evil thing? Because they were evil, they were power hungry, and their fixation on Jerusalem had nothing to do with Jesus. It had everything to do with power, and that was made quite evident in their actions in Constantinople. And this is what I said. And you had all these Catholics who came out to respond to me saying, oh, you're an idiot, and you're wrong, and you're this. Well, why am I wrong? Well, because the Crusades were based and awesome, and they were all about fighting Islam. Did you pay attention to anything that I said in my video? I said it was about a fixation on Jerusalem, and that is undeniable. Regardless of their fight against Muslims, it is undeniable that the Crusades was all about fixating on Jerusalem and Solomon's temple. What do you think the freaking Knights Templar was all about? Solomon's temple and all that nonsense. It was all about Jerusalem and the Temple Mount and who was going to control Jerusalem, because they had this idea that, well, because Christ was crucified and resurrected in Jerusalem, then therefore that the soil in Jerusalem is sacred and holy and we have to control it. And literally, St. John says Jerusalem is Sodom and Egypt. St. John doesn't tell us to revere Jerusalem. St. John tells us that Jerusalem is an evil city. And what does St. Paul tell us in his letter to the Hebrews? He says that we are members of heavenly Jerusalem. He doesn't mention earthly Jerusalem. He mentions heavenly Jerusalem, because that is what our focus is supposed to be on. Heavenly Jerusalem, not earthly Jerusalem. But all these Catholics came out and they were like, you're wrong, Theodore. The Crusades were based and awesome. Okay, so you're praising a militarist movement that fixated on a city that St. John called Sodom and Egypt. You're literally proving my point. And another thing that I want to mention is, look at the letter written by St. Peter Damian. St. Peter Damian wrote a letter on Sodom and Gomorrah. And it was an epistle about homosexuality in the priesthood. And it was written in the 1050s, all right, in the 1050s. So around 4 decades or so before the First Crusade. And St. Peter Damian tells us that the Catholic priesthood, he writes that the Catholic priesthood is so much riddled with homosexuality that homosexuality has literally spread like a cancer in the Catholic priesthood. He doesn't say that it's just a few cases of homosexuality. He says it has spread. He says that homosexuality has spread like a cancer in the priesthood. And this was around 4 decades before the First Crusade. So the Catholic Church was already rotting. And then you had the First Crusade. In the midst of all this insanity going on in the priesthood, where you had homosexuality, you had the First Crusade, and it was a militarist movement that was obsessed with a city that is called Sodom and Egypt in the Bible. Meanwhile, there was Sodom in the Catholic priesthood, and there was an obsession with Sodom, Jerusalem, figuratively Sodom. And the entire movement of the Crusades led to a disaster in which Christians were butchered, in which Jews were massacred after the conquest of Jerusalem, Muslim civilians were butchered. And here's another thing. There was also a hint of paganism in the Catholic world at this time. Go read the account of the First Crusade by Ralph of Cayenne. Ralph of Cayenne tells us that when the Crusaders invaded Jerusalem, and he praises this, he doesn't condemn it, by the way. He says that when the Crusaders invaded Jerusalem, they butchered civilians, and they butchered elderly people, and they butchered people mercilessly. And he praises this as if it's a good thing. And then he says, and Mars gave us victory. Mars, the Greco-Roman god of war, gave us victory. Why is Ralph of Cayenne, who was a Catholic monk, writing that a pagan deity of war gave the Catholics victory over Jerusalem? Why would a Catholic write that? Unless, of course, the Catholic world, the Western Catholic world in the Middle Ages was rotting, and you could definitely see it. But the Catholics today don't want to see this because they think that the Crusaders were based, and they want to be based and edgy, and they want to deny the Holocaust, and they want to praise Hitler. And they'll say, I'm not a Nazi, but they love Adolf Hitler. And Adolf Hitler was someone who hated their religion and loved eugenics. But yet they want to worship Adolf Hitler because they're not Christians. They're evil. That's the bottom line. And they keep proving my point about them. They keep proving my observations about them. Same thing goes with the fanatical pro-Israel people. Same thing goes with the fanatical evangelical Zionists like Mike Huckabee, who covers up for mass murder. It's all evil, and they will try to deny your observations while at the same time proving your point. Anyway, I've talked long enough, and it's getting dark. It was a lot of fun. Well, it was a dark topic nonetheless. But anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.